Hi class, in this video I want to give you a brief introduction to one of the philosophers that I find to be very interesting, exciting, fun to read, fun to teach, and his reputation precedes him, and that is Machiavelli. And here is a picture of the man himself. Although we are not reading The Prince in this class, it is probably his most famous work. And it is, as you can see, quite short. And if you're wondering why we don't read it in this class, it's because I teach it in a different class. In this class, we're looking at selections from this text by Machiavelli, The Discourses on Livy. And in today's video, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Machiavelli, his background, and I'll tell you who Livy is and why that's important. A little bit about Machiavelli. So Machiavelli lived from 1469 to 1527. And he lived in Florence. We all know Florence as one of the major cities in the Italian Renaissance, and Machiavelli was there in the thick of it. If everybody knows that about Florence, right? Florence, the Italian Renaissance, yay. What we need to keep in mind is that Italy in the Renaissance did not exist in the same way that Italy exists today. So, what do I mean by that? Well, Italy today has a flag, it has a national government, one Italian state stretching from the north of Italy all the way down to Sicily. One government, one state. In Machiavelli's time, the nation state known as Italy did not exist. In terms of politics, in terms of government, there was no such country as Italy. So Florence was an independent city-state. Venice was an independent city-state. And then there were other minor, independent city-states, Verona, Genoa, all of these places. And then you had the papal states, which were orbiting around Rome, and they were run by the Pope. And then farther south, you had the Kingdom of Naples. So Italy was, in a way, a lot like ancient Greece. You just had a lot of these different small political actors rather than one unified nation. So much so that only even at this time period that people begin to even think of themselves as Italians as opposed to Venetians or Tuscans or Florentines and things like that. When Machiavelli talks about what language he writes in, he talks about writing in Tuscan, right, which is the language of Tuscany. And people in Venice thought of themselves as speaking Venetian as opposed to, speaking Italian. Italian national consciousness, sort of the idea of an Italian nation or an Italian people, is beginning to emerge at this time, and Machiavelli, in the last chapter of The Prince, contributes to that. But it's not there yet. The reason I'm going on about this is that you have to understand the political situation of Italy was one of all these little city-states competing with each other. And what that means is that there was near constant war. They were constantly fighting. Sometimes they'd have big wars, sometimes they'd have little wars, but they were always at war with each other. Add to this that some of these city-states had allies outside of Italy, such as the French or the Spanish, or mercenaries hired from Switzerland or England. So that in addition to all the Italians fighting against each other, you also had these foreign armies and foreign mercenaries marching up and down the peninsula, causing problems in their own right. Although we are in the midst of the Renaissance, it's not all sweetness and light and beautiful art. It's actually a pretty tough time for a lot of people, and a lot of war and a lot of fighting. Machiavelli is born and bred in all of this. He's famous for saying that he loves Florence more than his soul. If you think about that, that tells you a lot about Machiavelli. He was born in Florence, and Florence was nominally a republic. I say nominally because while they maintained the, I guess you could say, the facade of a republican form of government, they were essentially ruled for many generations by the Medici family. The Medicis did this basically through charity, feed the poor, or if they bankroll the military when the city's under attack, and all of these things that people will vote for them and or their candidates in the elections. So that while the facade is that Florence is still a republic, the reality is that the Medicis run the city. And this was the case for some time until the Medici's fortunes changed and they were essentially run out of town. And a sort of a new reformed Republic of Florence was created. And Machiavelli, as a younger person, not too young, I guess maybe in his 20s or 30s, got a job working in this Florentine Republic, and he very quickly became a high-ranking figure in the city. His official title was Secretary to the Ten of War. Essentially what he was Secretary of State. He would go and meet with, the other Italian leaders in the peninsula and report back his findings and observations to this council of the Ten of War. That council would decide how is Florence going to interact with this or that, other power in the region. Machiavelli got a lot of political and diplomatic experience from this. Well, eventually the government that he was working for fell, and the Medicis were able to come back into power. Machiavelli is out of a job. To make matters worse, there is a conspiracy to try to overthrow the Medicis and return the old republic to power. This conspiracy was broken up and arrested. As they were gathering evidence on the conspiracy, they found a list of names of people that were involved in this conspiracy, and Machiavelli's name was on the list. Machiavelli finds himself arrested and thrown in a dungeon. He's tortured, and he's expecting that he will be executed, but Medici's finally decide that they are going to let Machiavelli go, but he has to live in exile. He can't live in the city of Florence anymore. He sort of has to live in the countryside outside of the city. He has very little money. He has very little resources, really very few friends or connections because he's persona non grata, right? He's in exile. But it's in that time period that he writes The Prince. Around that same time, or shortly after, he begins to attend these discussions with sort of the next generation of Florentines. He has this discussion with these two young men who he eventually dedicates the Discourses on Livy to, and the Discourses on Livy sort of emerge from these discussions. What are the Discourses on Livy? The Discourses on Livy, to begin with, we'll talk about Livy. Livy is a historian of ancient Rome. He lived during the time of Caesar Augustus, and he wrote a long, multi-volume history of Rome from the founding of the city all the way up to his present day. Now, today you could go to the library and you could read some of Livy's history of Rome. And you should, especially the first 10 books, because it's really exciting, it's really entertaining. You should read Livy. Even independent of Machiavelli, you should read Livy. But Machiavelli writes his Discourses on Livy sort of about Livy's history of ancient Rome. There's a couple of things that are significant about this decision, and I alluded to some of them in the previous video. Machiavelli in this book is essentially philosophizing, right? He's doing political philosophy, but he's doing it in a very new way. He's not referring back to the political philosophy of Plato or Socrates, right? You'll find very few direct references to Plato in here. He doesn't talk about Aristotle or Augustine and the city of God or anything like that. Machiavelli decides that he's going to philosophize on the basis of history and not on the basis of metaphysics, right? So if you think about Plato, you want to have knowledge of the forms, right? These eternal universal truths. So in Plato, we have Socrates talking about how rules should be based on knowledge and that ultimately you need to have knowledge of the forms. And so Platonic political philosophy is ultimately sort of based on metaphysics, right? Knowledge of these eternal universal truths, eidos, right? Knowledge of the forms. The ability to rule is going to be based on your knowledge of these forms. This is, in a sense, determinative of a very powerful tradition in political philosophy that approaches politics on the basis of metaphysics, on the basis of eternal and universal truths that our political regime has to somehow respond to. Machiavelli starts with history, right? Not with eternal universal truths, but with particular things that happen to particular people at particular times, right? Something that the Platonic and Aristotelian tradition is relatively uninterested in. If you remember in the Euthyphro, when Socrates asked Euthyphro for a definition of piety, Euthyphro's first answer is, well, piety is what I'm doing right now, taking my father to court, and blah, 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 blah. And Socrates says, I don't want examples, I want a definition. Well, if you think about history, history is a source of examples. It's exactly the kind of thing that Socrates is not interested in. So Machiavelli's decision to write about history is already revolutionary. From the very beginning, Machiavelli is saying, I'm not doing what Plato wants me to do. I'm not doing what Aristotle wants me to do. I'm not doing what Augustine would want me to do. I'm not doing what Thomas Aquinas would want me to do. I'm doing something radically new. The way he's doing something radically new is by going back to a different ancient source. And we'll talk about why that is. Right? In a sense, Machiavelli is saying, digging over here doesn't work. Digging in Plato, at Aristotle, that doesn't work. So let's go dig over here. Let's go look at what we can learn from Roman history. So we're looking at the preface of Book 1. And the preface of Book 1 is about a page and a half long. In the first paragraph of the preface, we see Machiavelli doing a couple things. He talks about the envious nature of men. One of the key ideas in Machiavelli, and that we'll come back to again and again, is that he thinks people are basically bad. What he wants to figure out is, how do we create peace amongst bad people? That's one thing. But then he goes on to say, although the envious nature of men has made it no less dangerous to find new modes and orders than to seek unknown waters and lands. This is an important phrase, new modes and orders. So Machiavelli is looking for new modes and orders, new ways of doing things, new ways of organizing things, new ways of thinking about things. A couple lines down, he'll say that he's going on a path as yet untrodden by anyone. So again, something new. New modes and orders, something new that no one has done before, but he thinks this will benefit everybody. He's not doing this for his own sake, he's doing this for everyone. And who is everyone? Everyone is everyone, right? This isn't just for him, it's not just for Florentines, right? He thinks that the new modes and orders that he's going to discuss will benefit anyone who understands them and puts them into action. So here's what gets weird. So if the first paragraph is all about new modes and orders, the second paragraph begins to talk about antiquity and the imitation of the ancients. So you might say, well, how am I going to get new modes and orders by imitating ancient things? Well, the comparison that he makes is with art, right? So if you know anything about Renaissance art, like Michelangelo, Raphael, and all of these guys, you know that they were inspired by ancient Greek and ancient Roman art, that they imitated the ancients in that sense. But they imitated them in a new way. In a sense, they began by imitating them, but their ultimate goal was to surpass them, to learn both from what the ancient artists did right, but also to see what they did wrong. And by having that knowledge of both what they did right and what they did wrong, then the Renaissance artists can do something new that's better than what the ancients did, by essentially learning from their mistakes, as well as from their triumphs. Well, Machiavelli wants to do something similar with politics. So what we need to do is learn from the mistakes of ancient leaders and ancient cities, but also learn from what they did right. Learn from both what they did right and what they did wrong. He says nobody has done this, right? We put all this energy into learning from ancient artists, but we haven't put any energy into learning from ancient captains and generals and statesmen and things like that. He says that the ancient kingdoms and republics are admired but not imitated, right? So we talk about ancient Rome and we talk about ancient Athens and Greek democracy or the Roman Republic, but we don't actually try to imitate it. We just sort of talk about it. We don't do anything. And when Machiavelli is going to say we need to start doing some things, he then introduces a key concept here in the next sentence, that of ancient virtue more generally. Like, one of the things that we'll look at in Machiavelli is his understanding of virtue. And his understanding of virtue is quite different from that of Socrates and Plato and things that we're familiar with. His understanding of virtue is very, very different. And of course it would be, because his starting point is very, very different. He's not starting from the forms or the ideas or anything like that. He's starting from history and particular people doing particular things. On the next page, he says, well, why is it that we don't imitate them? Why is it that we don't imitate the ancient cities and the ancient politics? We get a fairly spicy answer. He says, this, I believe, arises not so much from the weakness into which the present religion has led the world, or from the evil that an ambitious idleness has done to many Christian provinces and cities, as from not having a true knowledge of histories. So Machiavelli says, why is it that we don't do what the ancients did? Is it because we have a different religion than them, right? The ancients, they worshiped Zeus and Jupiter and things like that, and now here in Italy, we're Christians, and so since we have different religions, we behave differently. Machiavelli is going to say, not exactly, although he will have some thoughts on religion later, but at this point he's going to be coy and not tell us what he thinks. So you never discuss religion with someone you just met, and so Machiavelli's not going to do that either. We're going to have to get deeper into the book before we find out what Machiavelli really thinks about religion. So the problem that we have is not our religion, but it's that we don't have a true knowledge of histories. What this book is going to try to give us is, right, a true knowledge of histories. And that if we have this true knowledge of histories, essentially we'll understand what the ancients did right, what they did wrong, and then we'll be able to improve upon them and do something new and better. But one question is, well, why don't we have a true knowledge of histories? Like, that's the question that Machiavelli is kind of pointing us towards. It's not that we don't know the facts about ancient history here. So it's not that Machiavelli thinks that we don't have the correct facts about history. We have all the facts about the ancient world. We just don't understand those facts correctly. The problem, therefore, is not one that's going to be solved by getting more information about the ancient world, but rather it's a problem that is concerned with what we do and how we interpret the information that we already have. Machiavelli thinks that the interpretation that is popular in his time is the wrong interpretation. It's a misinterpretation. We might say, well, what is that interpretation? What's the wrong way to think about these things? So what is the wrong way to think about these things? What's the interpretation of these ancient histories that's been giving us a false knowledge of history? Well, Machiavelli is going to say that there's essentially two things that prevent us from understanding ancient history correctly. First is this belief that somehow things are different now, right? This belief that somehow the world and life today is different than life thousands of years ago. But Machiavelli says that that's an incorrect belief. He says, it's not as if the sun, heaven, elements, and men have varied in motion, order, and power from what they were in antiquity, right? We still live on the same planet. We still have the same seasons. We still get born. We still get sick. We still die. We still get hungry. We're still basically the same kind of thing, living in the same kind of world as the ancient Romans or the ancient Greeks. Even though lots of things have changed since then, Machiavelli is going to say the essence of things have not changed. So that's the first reason why we don't have a true knowledge of history. So we think that We think that they're so different from us that we can't learn anything from them, and so we don't bother. And we also think that we're so much more advanced than them that we can't learn anything from them. And Machiavelli thinks that's wrong, that essentially the existential situation of a human being today is the same as one thousands of years ago, right? Thousands of years ago, they worried about plagues. We worry about a pandemic. So that brings us to the second reason. The second reason why we don't have true knowledge of histories, Machiavelli thinks, is because we think we look at history as something that we can just read for sort of enjoyment and maybe some kind of generic inspiration, but not for knowledge. And the reason why goes all the way back to the Platonic conception of knowledge I was talking about earlier. All right. If you think knowledge is only of the forms, then you will not going to think that you could learn anything important from history. Platonism, the belief that the most important thing to know is eternal universal truths, gets in the way of us understanding history, gets in the way of us understanding ancient history. Buried in Machiavelli's opening preface is a number of subtle but important digs at Platonism and the Platonic tradition. The Platonic tradition is not going to help us politically. It's not going to help us learn from the ancients. It's not going to help us improve upon the ancients. And we're just going to be stuck in this rut. And if you think about the situation in Italy, it's this rut of these puny little city-states duking it out with each other again and again. And every so often, a foreign army comes in and attacks. If we just keep reading Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and people like that, we're not going to improve on our situation. If you want to improve on your situation, you've got to stop reading Plato. You've got to do something new. We got to have new modes and orders, and we have to have new paths. And the way we're going to get those new paths is not by looking at Plato, but by looking at Livy. Not by looking at philosophers and mathematicians, but looking at historians and seeing what we can learn from history. And that will enable us to improve our circumstances.